He got lost in the desert and was captured by a tribe of Apache women. Now their queen demands an heir. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when John Matthews packed the last of his supplies into his weathered backpack. He had always loved the desert, the endless stretches of sand, the quiet stillness, and the way the sun painted the landscape with gold and orange in the early morning hours. Today, he was determined to challenge himself, to explore a part of the desert few had walked before. He adjusted his hat, tightened the straps on his backpack, and set off with a confident stride. John had spent years preparing for solo trips like this. He knew the dangers of the desert: scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night, sudden storms, and the risk of getting lost in the vast, open terrain. Yet, despite all the warnings, he had a sense of excitement that made every risk feel worth it. He believed he could handle whatever nature threw at him. At first, the hike was beautiful. The desert seemed peaceful, almost welcoming. John walked along the dry riverbeds, admired the jagged rocks rising like monuments from the sand, and watched lizards dart across the warm ground. He stopped occasionally to drink water from his canteen and jot notes in his small journal. The quietness of the place was calming, and he felt completely free, away from the noise of the city and the pressures of everyday life. But as the day wore on, the sky began to change. Dark clouds crept across the horizon, and a faint wind started to stir the sand. John paused and looked up. He knew the desert could change in an instant, but he didn't expect the storm to come so quickly. Within minutes, the wind picked up, carrying grains of sand that stung his face and made it hard to see. He pulled a scarf over his mouth and nose and squinted against the sand. The storm grew stronger, and John realized that he had lost sight of the path he had been following. The familiar landmarks were gone, swallowed by the rising dunes. He tried to consult his map, but the wind had torn it from his hands and sent it fluttering across the sand. His GPS, which he relied on as a backup, had stopped working. He had forgotten to check the battery before leaving, and now it was dead. Panic began to creep in, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had survived difficult situations before, and he knew that losing his composure would make things worse. Hours passed, and the storm didn't relent. The sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sand. John's throat was dry, and his legs ached from walking on the uneven terrain. He tried to follow what he thought was a familiar trail, but every dune looked the same, a never-ending sea of sand. Fatigue began to cloud his mind. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the wind seemed to push him backward just as he moved forward. As darkness approached, John's options grew fewer. He knew he needed shelter or he wouldn't survive the cold night ahead. His eyes scanned the landscape, searching for any sign of refuge. In the dim light, he spotted a narrow canyon, partially hidden by the dunes. It wasn't much, but it promised some protection from the wind. With what little energy he had left, John made his way toward it. When he finally reached the canyon, he collapsed against the cool rock. His body ached and his mind was foggy from exhaustion. He tried to rest, but sleep was elusive. Every sound, the whistling of the wind, the distant call of a coyote, kept him alert. He knew that in the desert, danger could come at any moment, even from the smallest things. Hours passed, and John's hope began to fade. He had no idea how far he was from the nearest town or how long it would take for someone to find him. He thought about his family and friends, wondering if they were already worried. The thought of being alone in this vast, empty place was overwhelming. Yet even in his fear, there was a spark of determination. John refused to give up. He told himself that he had survived worse situations, and he would survive this one too. Just as he was beginning to feel completely hopeless, he noticed something unusual in the shadows of the canyon. Shapes moved silently, almost like whispers across the sand. At first he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the light and wind. But then the figures drew closer and John realized that he was not alone. He tried to call out, but his voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. The figures stopped, observing him from a distance. John couldn't tell how many there were, or whether they were friendly or hostile. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to assess the situation. He slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. To his surprise, one of the figures stepped forward. She was a tall woman, dressed in simple but sturdy clothing that blended with the desert. Her eyes were sharp and watchful, and she carried herself with a confidence that immediately commanded respect. Behind her, more figures emerged, all women, moving with the same silent precision. John realized that he was being watched by a group unlike any he had ever seen. The woman spoke, her voice calm but firm. John didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. She was in charge, and she wanted him to follow. He hesitated, unsure if he should trust them, but exhaustion and curiosity pushed him to comply. Slowly, he rose to his feet and followed her into the canyon, trying to appear calm despite the fear that gripped him. As they moved deeper into the shadows, John noticed that the canyon led to a hidden village. The sight took his breath away. The village was unlike anything he had imagined, with carefully arranged tents and huts, small fires burning in the open, and women moving gracefully between them. It was clear that this was not just a temporary camp, but a well-established community. John was led to a central area, where a woman sitting on a raised platform seemed to be waiting. She was taller than the others, her posture regal, and her gaze was sharp and commanding. John realized that this woman was the leader of the group. Everything about her told him that she was someone not to be underestimated. He was seated before her and she spoke again. This time he tried to communicate using gestures and simple words. Slowly, a pattern of understanding emerged. The woman and the other members of the group were cautious but not hostile. They were curious about him, and John could sense that his actions and words would determine how they treated him. As night fell over the desert, John sat quietly, absorbing everything around him. He was tired, hungry, and dehydrated, but he also felt a strange sense of awe. He had stumbled into a world completely different from his own, a hidden society that seemed both mysterious and fascinating. Despite the danger and uncertainty, he couldn't help but feel that his adventure was only beginning. The night was long, and John lay on the hard ground, thinking about how he had ended up here. He had come to the desert seeking challenge and solitude, but he had found something far more extraordinary, a hidden world filled with people he had never imagined, led by a powerful and commanding woman. As sleep finally claimed him, he knew that the days ahead would test him in ways he could not yet understand, and that his life was about to change forever. John woke with a start, the first rays of sunlight slipping into the small enclosure where he had spent the night. The air was cooler than the open desert, and he felt the faint scent of wood smoke. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he realized that he was no longer alone. Women moved quietly around him, tending to small fires, carrying water, and preparing simple meals. Their movements were graceful and purposeful, and John couldn't help but watch in awe. He remembered the woman who had brought him here the night before. She had commanded respect in a way he had never seen, and though he did not yet know her name, he could feel her presence in every movement of the village. It was clear that she was not just a leader in title but in action, shaping the lives of everyone around her. John cautiously rose to his feet, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. He tried to speak, but the words that came out were awkward and broken. The women paused and looked at him curiously. One of them approached, carrying a small bowl of water. She pointed at him, then at the water, and nodded. John understood. He took the bowl with gratitude, sipping slowly. The water was cool and refreshing, bringing life back to his parched throat. As he drank, John took in more of his surroundings. The village was hidden in a natural canyon, protected by rocks on all sides. Small huts made from wood and animal hides were arranged in neat circles, with open spaces in the center where fires burned and women gathered to work. The layout suggested careful planning and long-standing habitation. This was not a temporary camp. It was a fully functioning community. John tried to move slowly, careful not to appear threatening. The women watched him, but there was no aggression in their gaze. Instead, he sensed curiosity. They spoke among themselves in a language he did not understand, their voices soft but firm. He realized that he would need to be patient and observant if he hoped to gain any trust here. One woman, taller than the rest and wearing a distinctive necklace, stepped forward. She motioned for him to follow. John hesitated for a moment, then nodded and walked after her. She led him to a larger structure at the center of the village, where the tallest and most commanding woman, the one he had seen the night before, waited. Her presence was striking. She sat with her back straight, her eyes sharp, and her movements calm but powerful. John understood that this was the queen of the village. Everything about her indicated authority and wisdom. He knelt slightly, a gesture of respect he hoped would be understood. The queen looked at him intently, then motioned for him to rise. He could tell she was assessing him, trying to understand who he was and what he might bring to their community. Over the next several hours, John observed and learned. The women of the village worked together in harmony, sharing tasks, teaching younger members, and ensuring that everyone had what they needed. There was a quiet strength in their actions, a sense of unity that John had never experienced before. He noticed the respect they had for the queen, the way they listened to her instructions without question, and how they supported one another in their daily lives. John realized that he was witnessing a society unlike any other. It was a matriarchal community, led by women, where every decision was made with careful thought and the well-being of the group in mind. The balance of power and respect was evident in every interaction. For John, it was both fascinating and intimidating. He had entered the desert seeking adventure, but he had stumbled into something much more extraordinary. As the day passed, John began to interact with the women more. Though he did not understand their language, gestures, expressions, and shared tasks allowed him to communicate. He helped carry water, gather firewood, and prepare simple meals. His actions were cautious at first, but the women seemed to accept his help. Slowly, trust began to form, small but significant. One woman, younger than the rest, took a particular interest in him. She smiled often, showing him how to perform tasks and patiently guiding him through their routines. Through her, John began to understand more about the community's values: respect, cooperation, and the importance of protecting one another. He realized that he could not just be a visitor here. If he wanted to survive, he would need to adapt and contribute. As evening approached, the queen called a gathering. John was brought before her, along with several of the village women. She spoke in her language, her tone firm but not unkind. Though John did not understand the words, the seriousness of her demeanor was clear. She seemed to be explaining something important, and the women around him listened attentively. Afterward, one of the women helped John understand. Through gestures and simple signs, he learned that the queen had decided he would stay in the village for the time being. They were cautious, they explained, because he was an outsider. But he had proven himself willing to help, and they were curious about his skills and knowledge. It was not a choice John had in his hands. The village had decided, and he would follow their rules. The first night in the village passed quietly. John lay on a mat made from animal hides, listening to the sounds of the canyon. The crackle of fire, the occasional whisper of women moving about, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals filled the air. Despite his initial fear, he felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since getting lost, he was sheltered from the harshness of the desert, surrounded by people who, though cautious, were willing to allow him to live. Over the next several days, John settled into a routine. He woke early with the sun, helped with the daily tasks, and observed the women as they managed every aspect of the village. He learned how to make fire, gather edible plants, and understand the signs of the desert that were invisible to an untrained eye. The women were patient teachers, and John realized that survival in this environment required more than physical strength. It required respect, observation, and cooperation. During this time, he also began to notice the subtle ways the queen influenced the community. She did not shout orders or demand attention. Instead, she led through example and quiet authority. Her presence was felt everywhere, from the organization of tasks to the guidance of younger women. John found himself both fascinated and humbled by her strength and wisdom. One afternoon, as John helped repair a small water container, the queen approached him. She gestured for him to stop working and then led him to a quiet area near the edge of the village. She motioned for him to sit, and though he did not understand her words, the seriousness of her expression was unmistakable. She pointed to him, then to the village, then made a gesture that suggested something about the future. Through gestures and repeated explanations by other women, John began to grasp the meaning. The queen saw potential in him, not as a threat, but as someone who could play a role in the continuation of their community. It was a realization that both surprised and unnerved him. He had come here by accident, lost in the desert, and now he was being offered a chance to be part of something much larger than himself. As night fell over the canyon once more, John sat quietly by the fire, reflecting on the events of the past days. The fear he had felt at first had transformed into cautious curiosity and a growing respect for the people around him. He was no longer simply a lost traveler. He was a guest, a helper, and perhaps, in time, a participant in a society that was both foreign and fascinating. John realized that surviving in the desert was not just about finding water or shelter. It was about understanding people, respecting their ways, and learning to live within a system that was completely different from anything he had known. He felt a sense of humility, recognizing that the desert had led him here not just to test his endurance, but to challenge his understanding of life and human connection. As sleep overtook him that night, John knew that the days ahead would continue to test him. He had been captured, yes, but not in a way that threatened his life. Instead, he had been drawn into a community that operated on principles he had never experienced before. The queen had noticed him, and her interest suggested that his role in the village was only beginning to unfold. For the first time since he had entered the desert, John felt a spark of hope. He could survive here. He realized if he paid attention, worked hard, and respected the ways of the women who had saved him. And perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected journey into the heart of the desert would teach him more about himself than any adventure he had ever planned. Days turned into a week, and John Matthews began to feel like he was slowly becoming part of the hidden village. He was no longer just the lost traveler who had stumbled into their lives. He had become someone the women noticed, someone whose skills could be useful. He woke each morning with the sun, working alongside the villagers, learning more about their routines, and observing their careful balance of life in the harsh desert. One morning, while helping gather water from a nearby stream, John noticed the queen watching him from the edge of the village. Her presence was calm but commanding, and it made him feel both nervous and curious. She did not speak to him directly, but her eyes followed his every movement. John realized that she was studying him, assessing not just his actions, but the way he thought and reacted. The queen, Ahiana, seemed to understand that survival in this village required more than simple physical strength. It required understanding, patience, and respect for the community's ways. John approached her cautiously, carrying a small bucket of water. He bowed slightly, a gesture he hoped would show respect. Ahiana's lips curved into a faint smile, and she motioned for him to follow her. He felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. He had no idea what she wanted, but he knew it would be important. She led him to a quiet area near the village's center, where a low platform of stones formed a kind of seat. She gestured for him to sit. Ahiana began to speak in her language, but John did not understand the words. He watched her carefully, noticing her gestures, her expressions, and the way she held herself. Then, one of the younger women stepped forward to interpret. Through simple words and gestures, John learned that Ahiana wanted him to learn the deeper customs of the village, to understand not just how they lived, but why they lived that way. The queen wanted him to respect their traditions fully if he was to remain among them. Over the next several days, John immersed himself in the community's routines. He learned to prepare food the way they did, using simple tools and natural ingredients. He helped repair structures, carefully observing the techniques the women used to ensure stability and durability. He joined in their hunting and gathering, guided by the more experienced women who taught him how to read the subtle signs of the desert, the tracks of animals, the hidden sources of water, and the plants that could provide food or medicine. John found himself growing more connected to the women of the village. He shared stories of his past, using gestures and drawings to explain the world he had come from. The women listened with interest, asking questions through their interpreter. In return, they shared their history, traditions, and the ways they had learned to survive in the harsh desert over generations. John realized that this community was built not just on survival, but on trust, cooperation, and respect. Every action had a purpose, and every person had a role that mattered. One afternoon, while helping repair a small shelter near the edge of the village, John overheard a conversation that caught his attention. The younger women spoke in hushed tones about the importance of continuity, the need to ensure that their traditions and way of life could continue for future generations. John did not fully understand the details, but he sensed that this was a matter of great importance. He wondered what role he, as an outsider, could play in such a delicate system. That evening, Ahiana summoned him again. She gestured for him to sit before her and spoke with deliberate calm. The interpreter explained that the queen had noticed his skills, his willingness to learn, and his respect for the village. She believed that he could become more than a visitor. He could become someone who helped protect and strengthen the community. The queen's words were weighty, and John felt a mix of pride and apprehension. He had survived the desert and earned their trust, but now it seemed the responsibilities were becoming greater than he had imagined. John's curiosity grew as Ahiana began to show him the inner workings of the village. She explained, through gestures and examples, how decisions were made, how disputes were resolved, and how the community relied on everyone contributing their skills. The women worked together in a seamless rhythm, yet there was a strong sense of individuality within that unity. John realized that the queen's leadership was not about control, but about guidance, helping everyone find their strength while keeping the group safe and balanced. One evening, during a quiet moment by the fire, John was approached by one of the younger women, the one who had taken a special interest in him since the beginning. She handed him a simple bowl of food, then gestured for him to sit beside her. Through her gentle guidance, John began to understand more about the personal side of the village, friendship, loyalty, and care. It was a softer side of life here, contrasting with the strict routines and responsibilities that governed the community. John felt a warmth in this connection, a sense that he was becoming part of something larger than himself. As the days went by, John's understanding of the village deepened. He noticed the importance of rituals and ceremonies in marking events, celebrating achievements, and teaching lessons. The queen, Ahiana, played a central role in all of these moments, ensuring that the traditions were respected and that every member of the community felt valued. John admired her wisdom and the way she balanced strength with kindness. He began to feel a sense of loyalty, not just to the queen, but to the entire village. It was during one of these ceremonies that John first realized the true extent of Ahiana's influence. The women gathered around a small fire, performing movements that seemed both symbolic and meaningful. John watched closely, trying to understand the story being told through gestures, rhythm, and expression. The queen stood at the center, guiding every movement with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. John felt a mixture of awe and humility. He understood that this was more than a ceremony. It was a lesson in unity, respect, and the continuation of their way of life. The following day, Ahiana spoke to John again. Through the interpreter, he learned that she had a vision for the village's future, a vision that included him in an unexpected way. The queen explained that the village needed to ensure its continuity, and that she believed John could play a role in that effort. John felt a surge of emotion, pride, confusion, and a sense of responsibility all at once. He had never imagined that his accidental journey into the desert would lead to such a profound connection with another community. John spent the next several days reflecting on what this could mean. He realized that staying in the village would require commitment, effort, and a willingness to embrace a life completely different from the one he had known. Yet, he also recognized the opportunity to learn, grow, and contribute in ways he had never imagined. The desert, which had once seemed like a place of danger and isolation, had now become a place of discovery, challenge, and possibility. As he worked alongside the women, John began to see how his skills could benefit the village. He shared knowledge from his past experiences, techniques for preserving water, improving shelter, and navigating the desert. The women listened carefully, appreciating his contributions while teaching him how to adapt his knowledge to their traditions. It was a delicate balance, and John understood that earning their full trust would take time, patience, and respect. One evening, as the sun set behind the canyon walls, John found himself alone with Ahiana for a brief moment. She looked at him with an intensity that made his heart race. Without words, she conveyed a sense of expectation, responsibility, and trust. John realized that he was no longer just a visitor. He was part of the village's story, and the choices he made would have an impact on the community he had come to care for deeply. That night, as he lay on his mat, John reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The desert had been unforgiving, but it had led him to a place of connection, learning, and unexpected purpose. He thought about the trust the women had shown him, the guidance of the queen, and the bonds he was forming. Despite the uncertainty of the future, he felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. John understood that the coming days would be challenging. The queen's expectations were clear, and he knew he would need to prove himself further. But he also felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The desert had tested him in ways he had never imagined, and now it was teaching him lessons that went beyond survival, lessons of loyalty, respect, and the power of community. As sleep finally claimed him, John felt a sense of anticipation. The queen's vision for the village, the trust of the women, and his own desire to contribute all blended together into a sense of purpose. He had come to the desert seeking adventure, but he had found something far more meaningful. A chance to be part of a society that valued cooperation, wisdom, and the continuation of life in harmony with the harsh but beautiful world around them. John closed his eyes, ready to face the challenges ahead, knowing that his life had changed forever. Days passed, and John Matthews felt a growing connection to the village and its people. He had learned much about their ways, their customs, and their careful balance of life in the harsh desert. Every day brought new lessons: how to read the wind for signs of rain, how to find edible plants, and how to build tools from natural materials. Yet despite his growing comfort, a sense of tension had begun to settle in his chest. The queen, Ahiana, had started to show that her expectations for him were more than simple survival or cooperation. There was a weight in her gaze that he could not ignore. One morning, Ahiana summoned John to the center of the village. The sun was just rising, casting golden light across the canyon, and the women were busy with their daily routines. John felt nervous as he approached the queen. She gestured for him to sit on a flat stone in front of her, and the younger women stood behind him, watching quietly. Ahiana's expression was calm but serious. The interpreter explained that the queen wanted John to understand something very important, something that would change his role in the village forever. John listened carefully as Ahiana spoke. Through the interpreter, he learned that the queen had been observing him closely. She had seen how he adapted to the village's ways, how he treated the women with respect, and how he shared his knowledge without trying to dominate. The queen valued these qualities, but she also explained that the village faced a challenge that went beyond daily survival. She gestured toward the younger women, then toward John, indicating that the village needed someone who could help ensure its future. The interpreter explained that Ahiana believed the village needed an heir, a person who could contribute to the next generation and continue the tribe's traditions. The queen's words struck John like a sudden wind. He had not expected to be asked to play such an important role. The responsibility felt enormous, and he could see the seriousness in the faces of the women around him. This was not a request made lightly. It was a matter of life, continuity, and honor for the village. John felt a mixture of emotions, fear, surprise, and a sense of responsibility he had never faced before. He had survived the desert and adapted to the village, but now he was being asked to make a decision that would shape the lives of many. He looked at Ahiana, seeing not just a leader but a woman who carried the hopes and dreams of her people. He realized that the village had grown to depend on him in ways he had never imagined. Over the next few days, John struggled with his thoughts. He spent time alone, walking near the edge of the canyon, reflecting on what it would mean to accept the queen's request. He thought about the life he had left behind, the family, the friends, and the world outside the desert. Accepting this responsibility would mean leaving that life behind, at least for a time, and embracing a future he could not fully predict. Yet, he also felt a pull toward the village, a connection to the people who had welcomed him and the queen who had trusted him. As John wrestled with his decision, he continued to participate in the village's routines. He helped with hunting, gathering, and preparing food, but he also spent time learning from the women about the deeper customs of the community. He attended ceremonies, observed rituals, and listened carefully to the lessons passed down from the elders. Each experience reinforced the importance of trust, respect, and cooperation. The more he learned, the more he understood why the queen had placed such faith in him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the canyon walls, John was walking back from the water source when he noticed the queen waiting for him. She gestured for him to sit beside her, and for the first time, she spoke to him without an interpreter. Though he did not understand the words, her tone was patient, firm, and full of meaning. He could feel the weight of her message even without translation. She was giving him time to reflect, to think carefully about his choice, and to show that she trusted him to decide responsibly. John spent a long night thinking. He considered the hardships he had faced in the desert, the exhaustion, the fear, the isolation, and compared them to the life he had found among the women of the village. He realized that survival alone was no longer enough. He had been offered a chance to be part of something greater, something meaningful. The idea of responsibility frightened him, but it also inspired a sense of purpose he had never felt before. In the following days, John began to test himself in new ways. He practiced skills that could help the village, experimented with techniques for improving water storage, and learned more about the plants and animals of the desert. The women watched him closely, offering guidance and support, but also observing how he handled challenges and setbacks. John realized that every action, no matter how small, had consequences in this tightly woven community. He could not act recklessly. He had to be thoughtful, careful, and respectful in all that he did. As the Queen's expectations became clearer, John also felt the weight of his decision growing heavier. He understood that choosing to accept her request would change his life forever. He would no longer be a traveler wandering the desert alone. He would be a part of the village, a contributor to its future, and someone who bore responsibility for its well-being. At times, the thought overwhelmed him, and he doubted whether he could live up to such expectations. Yet, in his heart, he also knew that he had come far already. He had survived the desert, adapted to a new culture, and earned the trust of the women. Perhaps he was ready for this next challenge. One afternoon, while helping repair a small shelter, John noticed the younger women speaking quietly among themselves. They glanced at him occasionally, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hope. He realized that the village was watching him closely, waiting to see how he would respond to the Queen's challenge. This understanding strengthened his resolve. He could not make this decision lightly, but he could not ignore it either. His actions would have real consequences, and he needed to approach them with thoughtfulness and care. That evening, the Queen called another gathering. John was brought before her, the younger women standing respectfully behind him. Ahiana's eyes met his, calm and expectant. Through the interpreter, she reminded him of the responsibility he faced, the need to help ensure the village's continuity and honor their traditions. She emphasized that this was not just about him. It was about the community, the future, and the legacy they had built together. John listened carefully, understanding the depth of what was being asked. He realized that the Queen's request was not meant to control him or limit his freedom. Instead, it was an opportunity to contribute to something larger than himself, to play a meaningful role in a community that had welcomed him when he was lost and alone. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but it was also inspiring. Over the next several days, John spent time preparing himself. He focused on learning more about the village's traditions, observing the Queen's leadership, and understanding the deeper meaning behind the customs he had been introduced to. He also spent time in quiet reflection, considering how his decision would affect the women, the younger members of the village, and the future of the community. One night, as he sat by the fire, John realized that he had reached a turning point. The desert had tested him in countless ways, forcing him to rely on his skills, his courage, and his determination. Now he faced a different kind of challenge, one that required wisdom, compassion, and a willingness to embrace a life he had never imagined. He understood that accepting the Queen's request would not be easy, but it was a path that could lead to purpose, connection, and meaning. The following morning, John approached the Queen. He knelt slightly, showing respect, and gestured to indicate that he was ready to discuss his choice. Ahiana's expression softened, and she nodded. Through the interpreter, John expressed his willingness to accept the responsibility, acknowledging the trust she had placed in him and the importance of the village's future. The Queen's eyes shone with approval, and the younger women smiled quietly behind him, relieved and hopeful. With that decision, John felt a mixture of relief, pride, and anticipation. He had faced the desert, survived its challenges, and now embraced a role that carried meaning beyond himself. He understood that the coming days would bring new responsibilities, challenges, and lessons, but he also felt ready. The desert had shaped him, the village had taught him, and the Queen had given him a purpose that he could not have imagined when he first got lost in the sands. As he lay down that night, the stars stretching across the desert sky, John felt a profound sense of connection. He was no longer just a traveler lost in the wilderness. He was a part of a community, entrusted with a future that would depend on his actions, his respect, and his dedication. The desert, which had once seemed harsh and unforgiving, had become a place of learning, discovery, and unexpected opportunity. John closed his eyes, ready to face whatever the next chapter of his life would bring, knowing that he had chosen a path of responsibility, growth, and belonging. The morning sunlight spilled across the canyon as John Matthews rose with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The desert, which had once seemed endless and threatening, now felt alive and full of possibilities. After days of reflection and careful consideration, he had accepted the Queen's challenge and committed himself to the village's future. This decision had brought a mixture of excitement, responsibility, and hope that settled deep within him. John stepped outside his small shelter and inhaled the crisp desert air. Around him, the women of the village were already at work, carrying water, tending to small gardens, and preparing the day's tasks. He noticed the subtle nods and glances of encouragement they gave him. Even the younger women who had once been cautious around him now moved with quiet trust, confident that he was committed to learning, helping, and participating fully. The Queen, Ahiana, appeared near the center of the village, standing tall and composed as always. She watched John with the same calm intensity that had first unsettled him when he arrived. Today, however, there was a different tone in her expression, a sense of satisfaction, approval, and quiet pride. John approached her, bowing slightly as a sign of respect, and she gestured for him to follow her. She led him to a small platform, the same one where she had first explained the responsibilities of the role she now entrusted to him. The younger women gathered around, their expressions a mix of curiosity and excitement. The interpreter explained that the Queen wanted the village to officially recognize John's commitment. It was a ceremony, small but meaningful, to mark the beginning of his new life and the responsibilities he had chosen to embrace. As John knelt before the Queen, she placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Through the interpreter, she spoke of trust, responsibility, and the importance of his actions in shaping the village's future. John listened carefully, feeling the weight of her words. This was more than a simple ceremony. It was a moment of recognition, a bond between him, the Queen, and the women who had accepted him as part of their lives. The younger women stepped forward, offering symbols of the village's traditions, woven bands, small tokens of respect, and gestures of acceptance. Each action carried meaning, representing trust, community, and continuity. John received these offerings with humility, understanding that they were not gifts in the usual sense, but commitments, a shared promise to support one another and work together to sustain the village's way of life. After the ceremony, John spent the day helping with various tasks, now fully recognized as a participant in the village. He repaired tools, gathered firewood, and assisted in preparing meals. The women worked alongside him as equals, offering guidance when needed, but trusting him to handle his responsibilities. John felt a sense of belonging he had never known, a quiet satisfaction in contributing to the well-being of the community. Over the next several weeks, John continued to integrate himself fully into village life. He learned more advanced survival skills, studied the medicinal properties of local plants, and observed the patterns of desert animals to help the women with hunting and gathering. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn, grow, and deepen his connection to the village. John also grew closer to the Queen, Ahiana. She shared with him more about the history of the tribe, the lessons learned from past generations, and the vision she held for the community's future. John admired her wisdom, strength, and the careful way she balanced leadership with compassion. Their bond was built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and a recognition of each other's strengths. One evening, as the sun set behind the canyon walls, John and Ahiana walked together along a narrow ridge overlooking the village. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the desert stretched endlessly beyond. John reflected on his journey, from being lost in the desert, exhausted and disoriented, to becoming a trusted member of this extraordinary community. He realized that every step, every decision, and every act of patience had brought him to this point. Ahiana spoke softly, pointing to the village below and then to the horizon. Though John did not understand her words, her gestures and tone conveyed meaning. The importance of protecting the village, guiding its future, and preparing for the generations to come. John nodded, feeling the responsibility settle in his chest, but also a sense of pride and purpose. He was ready to embrace this role fully. Over time, John became not just a helper, but a teacher and guide in his own right. He shared knowledge from his past experiences, techniques for water storage, ideas for shelter, and methods for understanding desert weather patterns. The women listened carefully, adapting his knowledge to their traditions and practices. Together, they strengthened the community, combining generations of wisdom with John's perspective from the outside world. The younger women looked up to him with respect and trust, often seeking his guidance on small tasks. John felt a deep sense of fulfillment in being able to contribute in meaningful ways. He understood that he had been given more than survival. He had been given a chance to be part of a legacy, to help the village thrive and continue in harmony with the desert that had once threatened him. One day, while gathering food near the edge of the canyon, John encountered a small group of travelers. At first, he felt the old pull of the world beyond the desert, the life he had left behind, the possibilities outside the canyon walls. But as he watched the villagers working together, laughing and supporting one another, he realized that he no longer belonged to that world. His heart and mind were here, among these people who had welcomed him, trusted him, and taught him the true meaning of community. When he returned to the village, the queen greeted him with a quiet smile. John understood that she had noticed his reflection and the choice he had made to remain and dedicate himself to this life. The bond between them and between him and the entire village had grown stronger than ever. He had accepted not just a role, but a purpose, and in doing so, he had found belonging, meaning, and a sense of home in a place he had once feared. As weeks turned into months, John and the queen worked together to guide the village, ensuring that traditions were respected and knowledge passed down. John participated in ceremonies, contributed to decision-making, and supported the younger women in learning essential skills. He realized that the desert, once harsh and isolating, had become a teacher, shaping him into someone capable of responsibility, empathy, and leadership. The village flourished, and John found joy in the simple, meaningful life he had embraced. The women of the community valued his contributions. The younger members looked up to him, and the queen continued to guide and support him with wisdom and care. John knew that he had been given a second chance, a chance to be part of something enduring, something greater than himself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the canyon cliffs, John stood beside Ahiana, watching the women of the village gather around the fire. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and the warmth of community embraced him. He realized that the desert had brought him here for a reason, not to challenge him alone, but to introduce him to a world where trust, cooperation, and respect created life that could endure even in the harshest conditions. John smiled, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment. He had been lost, captured by circumstance, and yet, through patience, respect, and determination, he had found a place where he belonged. The desert, once a symbol of danger and isolation, had become a symbol of growth, discovery, and connection. He understood that life in the village would not always be easy, but it would always be meaningful. As night fell over the canyon, John lay on his mat, listening to the quiet sounds of the village. The wind whispered through the rocks, the fires crackled softly, and the women moved about their evening tasks. He felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also a profound sense of belonging. He was no longer just a visitor or a lost traveler. He was part of the village, part of a legacy, and part of a story that would continue long after he was gone. John closed his eyes and reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and forced him to grow. The queen had trusted him, the women had guided him, and he had learned lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. He realized that sometimes, being lost was only the beginning of finding a life far richer and more meaningful than he could have ever imagined. With a final deep breath, John felt a quiet joy. He had found home in the most unexpected of places. The desert, the village, the queen, and the women had all become part of him. And in embracing his role, he had not only survived but truly lived, connected, respected, and ready to face the future alongside the people who had shown him the meaning of trust, courage, and community.